Good morning again. As Sarah said, my name's Audrey. Sorry, pardon me, I'm losing my voice. But my name's Audrey Smith. I don't actually work in libraries. I'm a PhD student at the University of Florida in the Department of Geography. And today I'm talking about some research I did with some fellow PhD students and a professor at the University of Florida. We were looking into how article processing charges impact author diversity, publishing open access, and also how waivers play into that. So we just recently published this paper. I've kind of tweaked the name of it for this presentation, but basically the title of this presentation is Equity in Publishing and Author Diversity. Are article processing charges barriers to open access publication for authors in the Global South? Again, forgive me for my voice. So in science research, open science and scholarly communication is at the heart of science. Communication, sharing of ideas, results, and data is really what drives science and the proliferation and dissemination of knowledge, and building on the work of colleagues and generating new knowledge. And also in science, we're really interested in reproducible science. And part of reproducible science is open access, having the availability to all for the access of publications and data without barriers. Like paywall subscriptions, journals, and other barriers, financial, legal, or otherwise. And I think most of you already know the benefits to open access, treating, when we talk about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, knowledge should be a public good, available to all without barriers, so that we can accomplish this equity and access and the discovery of knowledge. But one thing that's often left out of the conversation is, with the proliferation and the rise in open access in the last couple of decades, sometimes in the conversation, what is not talked about is open access to publishing for authors. So for instance, now, I'm at the University of Florida, so I have access to a lot of journals through our library system. But let's say I'm a researcher from an independent researcher, a researcher from the Global South. Well, with open access, I have research to the scientific publications, but do I have access to publishing them? And there are barriers, significant barriers for some authors, and many of these are financial. So my talk is more from the author perspective and scientist perspective, excuse me. So I think most of you also aware, and I've just, as I became a PhD student, learned more about this, the benefits of open access for authors and scientists. And, obviously we reach a broader audience and we increase our impact and visibility. There's also been research that shows we have higher citation rates, which is very important for especially early career researchers, or I'm still doing the PhD, so I'm not even early career yet, but we need to have publications and citations to get a job, and then for career advancement, and also for funding compliance. For instance, I'm working on a project funded by the National Science Foundation that my advisor has, and the funding compliance is you need to publish open access to make publicly funded research available to the public. There's also greater opportunities for collaboration with open access research. This is just showing you how these the citations have actually, open access publications accrue more citations over time. So that's a great advantage for authors. But there are, like I said, are barriers to open access publishing for authors. In our research and in our literature review, we discovered that a lot of research showed that authors actually have some hesitation publishing open access because of the perceived journal reputation. Does this open access journal have the same reputation as this subscription traditional publishing model journal that's been around longer? And that's always a big factor. Does it have a actual, the impact factor? We're taught as researchers and scholars, we're supposed to shoot for high impact factors. And, I have some qualms with that. But that's what we're sort of told, you want these high impact journals, and some of the newer open access ones don't always have that established impact factor yet. But more importantly, or just as importantly, there can be financial barriers. Now, while there's plenty of open access journals that do not charge open article processing fees, many of the prestigious open access journals do charge these article processing fees to offset the loss of revenue that they generate from subscription journals. But when you think about this, these fees can range from $1,000 to $4,000. And now, while I come from a privileged Western country, as a student, I'm a poor student right now. Actually, I don't have access to, but my university, sometimes I can apply for some help with this. But many independent researchers, other students, and people from lower middle income countries and different institutions that don't have this financial resources don't have access to that. And so these article processing charges can be a financial barrier to authors who may otherwise publish open access. This just shows the differing fees for some prestigious journals and their varying article processing charges. And again, they can range, from hundreds of dollars, but usually they're in the thousands of dollars. When we talk about waivers, even though there's eligibility for waivers, sometimes, a 50% waiver, if the article processing charge to publish is $4,000, a 50% waiver doesn't cut it. So we did this research looking at how does article processing charges affect the geographic diversity of authors publishing open access. So, excuse me, we decided to use Elsevier's Mirror Journal. Elsevier recently came up with this mirror journal system. So they have traditional subscription-based journals that are well-known, and then they have their mirror journals. For instance, as you can see in that picture, World Neurology and then World Neurology X. And World Neurology X is the matching mirror journal. So we're calling these parent and mirror journals. Mirror are the open access matching journal, and parent journals are the traditional subscription-based. So this was actually for our, when we're doing a sort of a research design, this actually makes an ideal natural experiment design because we have a control and a treatment group. And between these mirror and parent journals, this eliminates some of the other confounding factors for this type of sort of research, where these two journals, the matching parent and mirror journals, have the same aim and scope, potential author base, editorial process and criteria, and span a breadth of different disciplines. So again, we're referring to parent as the non-open access and mirror as the open access. And we used diversity metrics, what are commonly used in information science and also ecology, actually. So essentially, we took these diversity metrics from ecological science, and applied this to this study. So we found 38 journals, matching parent and mirror journals from Elsevier, and we downloaded the complete reference records for all articles published in 2020 and through the Web of Science, Core Collection, and Scopus databases. And each article from the parent journal was identified because some of those are actually hybrid, and they might have the OA or open access option in the parent journal. So we teased that out and actually ended up doing this analysis for all sets. I'll get into that. And so for every article, we identified the first author or lead author's country of primary institutional affiliation. So if they're based in the USA, China, this is the first or lead author, because those are the ones who are primarily responsible for article processing charges. So their primary country of institutional affiliation, where they could be based, in Latin America, Peru, or China, Canada, or Liberia, South Africa. And so this is how we were looking at the geographic diversity based on their country of primary institutional affiliation. And then we assigned each country to the World Bank region and World Bank lending group or national income categories, and also the Elsevier APC waiver group. And then we employed these diversity indices derived from information theory and ecology. And all of our analyses were carried out in our statistical programming language. I don't really need to get into this, but this is basically how the diversity metrics work. These are often applied in, we're talking about biological diversity. These are often used in this, but we found that we can apply this to diversity of authors based on these two metrics. We have richness. And so we're looking at the number of countries that first authors from a group of journals are based, and articles within those journals, and the evenness is the relative proportion of first authors based in each country to get this diversity index of sentiment, it's called. So basically we compare the diversity of authors publishing open access articles in mirror journals versus non-open access articles in the parent journals. And we did this analysis for two types of lead authors or articles: authors of single author papers, so they're obviously lead authors, and the first author or lead author of co-authored papers. So some preliminary results: there's 975 articles in the open access mirror journals. And since these were actually just established more recently and not as well known, and for other factors as well, as you can see, significantly fewer articles in the open access mirror journals than the parent journals, where there was over 36,000, of which about 18,000. Oh, 2 minutes. Okay. So what we found is, though, overall, when we pooled all articles, their lead authors were based in 144 countries, but these varied significantly based on the article type. So here's some examples. So what we found is that of all single author and lead author articles, they were in open access and parent journals much more represented by high income countries. What we also found is there was an extreme dominance in all categories by USA and China, so we had to adapt for that. And we ended up, this is something you do in ecology too, if you have an over-representation of a certain group or species, that would be in ecology. So then we removed China and USA from this analysis. And before we removed them, we found that the geographic diversity of authors and open access was greater than non-open access. But after we accounted for these dominating countries that were the majority of the publications, open access diversity of authors was significantly less than that of non-open access or parent journal diversity, which supported our predictions. I'm almost finished. Okay. So overall, we found that in the open access journals, the ones that authors have to pay to publish, there are many more authors from North America, Europe, Central Asia, and Pacific regions. And in the non-open access parent journals, we saw authors from lower income and middle income countries, and same with national income groups. So basically our results strongly suggest that article processing charges are a barrier to open access publication by authors based in low income countries of the global South. And authors publishing open access were concentrated in high income countries. And a very interesting thing that we found is middle income countries were very underrepresented. And part of this we think is because of how waivers work. Middle income countries often do not qualify for waivers, or there's inconsistency. And surprisingly, even though low income countries often qualify for 50 to 100% waivers, they still weren't publishing open access. So we find that to be an issue with waiver system in general. The application process, the awareness among authors, and even how maybe journals go about it. We think that recommendations would be that there should be a more straightforward process, and even journals should have an automatic system where it recognizes a country and if they're eligible for a waiver or author from that, and make it an automatic process. And also to be more clear on the website with these waiver. So what we found is that these waivers are really not actually helping improve the diversity, equity, inclusion of authors publishing open access. Thank you very much.
All right, that was actually really helpful to start my presentation. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So good morning again. My name is Sara Rouhi from PLOS. I'm really excited to share with you our similar findings that waivers do not contribute to DEI in the context of publishing, by lifting the hood a bit on how publishers, at least how PLOS does waivers, and credit to Curtis for really pushing this as an important topic to communicate with libraries, especially since PLOS is in the process of trying to engage more with libraries globally. And I want to give a shout out to preprints, which is how I found Audrey's research, which has now been published, and we've been sharing on Twitter and other pathways. But I think we all assumed that APCs were exclusionary, but to have some substantive research that actually validates that, I think is really useful. So I think most of you know about PLOS, but if you don't, briefly, we're one of the first digital native open access journals. All of our content is open. All of our licenses are CC BY. And just this year, we launched 5 new titles. And in the last 12 months, we've launched 2 non-APC business models, largely to address this question of equity. All of our titles engage in sort of the best practices around open science, and they're all funded either by APCs or non-APC based models, but the majority of our revenue is still very much APCs. So I'd like to give a little background on how we got there, and I'll do it quickly. From our perspective, launching with APCs in the early 2000s, we didn't recognize how successful they would be as a business model. We certainly didn't appreciate that they would sort of generate a crop of publishers engaging in bad faith and predatory publishing. We didn't anticipate how much money was in the system, that authors would be able to pay to make content open while libraries were paying to facilitate closed content for their institutions, so the double dipping issue. And then we overestimated the ability of waivers to really foster inclusion. And these are the kind of blind spots that I think anyone would have had at the time. So in terms of what's wrong with waivers from the publisher perspective, they are finite in terms of how much we can support. They're very expensive, both to implement and to actually pay out. It's a subjective process in terms of determining if someone merits a waiver. It's so that there's an element of arbitrariness to some of that. It's unsustainable, at least for PLOS in the long term, as a way to facilitate inclusion. And then for authors, they are incredibly time-consuming processes, as with any kind of needs-based support. There's a lot of onus we put on authors to prove that they need one. The needs-based approach is never really designed for dignity, and a lot of authors sort of give up once they enter this process, if they even know that waivers are a thing, which to your point is an issue. Many are not aware of an option, and it's not a guarantee of support. You may you may submit a paper assuming you have funding, and 6 months later, the paper is accepted, but your funding has run out, and at that point, you need a waiver. For us at PLOS, that's a really hard thing to solve for. So a lot of challenges on both sides, and which sort of is leading to this conclusion that waivers aren't equitable. And I want to take a second to define what we mean by equity, because this word is getting thrown around so much that I think there's a lot of value to understanding where PLOS is defining it from. And we're really using the framework that you see that has been credit to early childhood development and elementary education. This is a framework that's been used for decades in that space. Sort of the difference between equality and equity, right? Equality is treating everyone the same, not recognizing that there are systemic, there are structures that don't have everyone starting at the same starting line, if you will. Equity is about shifting those systemic structures such that everyone can have the same experience in spite of wherever they are relative to that starting line. So in terms of this somewhat belabored metaphor, if we think of scientific knowledge, everything about it, from the generation to the dissemination to the accessibility to the sharing of data, all of that as the baseball game, we think of the fence as any barrier to participation in watching or playing the game. We have the folks for whom the fence is not an issue. They may not be aware of an issue. They've lived and worked within the context of the fence. They probably helped build the fence in some cases. And then we have everybody else, right? For very different reasons. It doesn't really necessarily matter what country you're in. There are going to be many reasons that you may not be able to get over that fence. And so what we're really trying to do, both with our business models and our examination of waivers, is to figure out what are the systemic changes that we can make to start making it easier for everyone to get over the fence. And really, this is probably more an accurate representation of how a lot of these systems work in scholarly communications. That's what equality might look like. That's what equity might look like. And ultimately, you know, the ideal you'll never get to, but you hope for, is just removing the fence such that anyone who needs to engage in this process and this community can do so from where they're at with the means that they have. So waivers have both been part of the process of eliminating the fence, but in some ways have become their own fence. So I'm actually just going to quickly show you how arduous this is from the PLOS perspective, understanding that we're trying to move away from this. So by the time you've, has anyone ever done this is a very American-centric question, but has anyone ever done their taxes on like TurboTax or, so you know that, and you get to like the 50th page where it asks you a question and you're like, I'm just done, just next page, next page. That's what happens to authors when they get to this point. They've already probably spent an hour trying to submit by the time they've gotten to this section. We know authors don't love reading detail. So if any of them read any of this to realize there are supporting mechanisms, that's great. But then if they choose to participate in either of the programs that PLOS has, they then have to go through a number of steps that can go on for pages. This is a scrolling experience, mind you, in Editorial Manager. We asked them about 4 different times, are you sure? Are you sure you don't have funding? Are you sure? Are you sure? And then if they complete that process in one of the 2 ways that we have, there's still a person on the PLOS side that has to individually verify all of the information that the authors provided. There is a lot of emailing back and forth. The carbon footprint of just getting someone to provide the information, respond to an email, really, really high. There's a decision-making flowchart, but there's still a person making a call. Authors often are not engaged until they realize their paper was accepted, which is often too late. And then there's just never enough money to meet the demand. We can never, if we wanted to be truly inclusive and just waive for everyone, we can't do it in an APC paradigm. So right now, about 3/4 of the waiver requests are granted, but they are rarely 100% waiver requests. And so to many researchers, it's very nice that they got a 50% discount on that APC, but that's still an APC they can't pay because there was never any money to begin with, right? Reasons range from usually the researcher just not coming back with evidence of need and or research figuring out that they have funding. So the data is moving in better directions. What we're looking at here is all of the fee assistance by percentage over time. So starting in 2016, we were really doing more in North and South America, in Europe, and in Asia. And over time, we've been moving in the direction that we want to move, where the underrepresented regions are seeing much more support, and we're spending less on supporting researchers in those other regions. That's not a good thing. That's just a shift of trying to support based on geographic inequity rather than career inequity, right? There are still many early career researchers and researchers in unfunded fields in the global north that need support. So it's a shift because the resources are finite. Additionally, the dollar value that we've been spending to support various regions has been going up in underrepresented geographies, but still doesn't address the challenge for many researchers in the global north that need support. And then lastly, the thing that's kind of gutting the most is the number of waivers that we are able to grant is going down because of the financial component and because the demand for waivers is really shooting up. So in 2020, I suspect the reason that last bar for each subject area is lower in 2020 is I believe we actually increased the amount of each dollar waived, which meant we could do fewer waiver requests as a whole. So, you know, there's an inverse. You start doing more of one, it's reduced somewhere else. So waivers can't bring equity to a system. If it's just a publisher and an individual author having an interaction, where is the funder? Where are the libraries? Where are the research offices and institutions? There's more stakeholders who could be helping move the needle here. We really ideally need solutions that help entire regions or institutions that are not as arbitrarily person by person focused. And PLOS's recent new business models, community action publishing and global equity, are both trying to experiment with doing that. We need to obviously try to move away from needs-based support as much as possible. And hopefully all of this allows an author to just look at the journal they want to publish in without having that internal monologue. Is there an APC? Oh, well, I can't go. I'll go somewhere else. All of that, ideally, we can eliminate so folks can engage as they want. So PLOS is doing some work on this. I want to make sure we leave time for Curtis. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Curtis.
So thanks to Audrey. Good. I think Audrey outlined the problem with her research. I think Sara just, that's an interesting case study of a publisher that's actually taking this serious and looking at the data and lessons learned and thinking about how they can address these issues. And in my close here was like kind of the call to action piece. And what I'm going to do is just run through some things that, I think the different stakeholder groups that Sara mentioned can actually do. So starting with publishers, a big issue is that, even if a waiver program is run well, they're typically only extended to a subset of a publisher's journals, right, to the gold journals, so including hybrids. And I think this is really important for publishers that have made a commitment to an APC-based OA transition. So if we think about Cambridge and we think about Wiley, these are publishers that are, moving forward with, more of like a read and publish style transition. And I think that the hybrid should be rolled into the waiver programs, and figuring out how to do that is something that needs to be done. I think if waivers for a publisher, if waivers are not available for all of your journals, you need to make sure that the list of journals that you do allow waivers for is accessible to authors. Has just been another pain point we've heard about. Qualifying authors for waiver programs should be automatically identified. You know, that Sara was able to walk through the PLOS. So here's a publisher that really cares about this, and even they have just a really convoluted, difficult process in order to go through to get the waivers. So waivers that need to be requested, if that's how you're going to reach for equity, if you're a publisher, they need to be easy, they need to be fast, and they need to be clear to authors on how they actually get them. And if you don't know what your process is like from an author requesting a waiver perspective, survey your authors, talk to them, and see what that experience is like for someone that actually has to go through these hurdles that Sara was showing what they could look like. So for librarians, I think we do have a role to play with this. And I think that at Iowa State, at my home institution, we've been negotiating open access agreements for the last couple of years. And it is really not until this year that we have started really thinking about the waiver piece. And if we're going to be making APC-based agreements, then the waiver piece should be part of our conversation with the publisher. So it's not enough for libraries just to be told by the publisher. It's like, yes, we have a waiver program, when we know that there are all these issues with waiver programs. I think we need to dig into it. You know, what does the waiver program cover? What is the criteria? What is the process? How many are you giving out? You know, is the waiver program sufficient? And I think some of this can enter into, some of this could go in the direction of being contractual, right? I think as a community, if we develop best practices for waiver programs as this temporary solution that they might be, why wouldn't that be in our contract? Just like we put in language around accessibility expectations, why wouldn't we have language in our contracts about expectations on how these programs should be ran? And then the last thing I will just say, this really is a community problem, and it needs to be a community conversation. You know, what are the best practices for the waiver programs, and how are we going to implement them? And if you haven't seen it, the report from 2020 that came out of the UK, partially funded by UKRI, this is the one that has a real long title. It's Open Access Challenges and Opportunities for Low and Middle Income Countries and the Potential Impact of UK Policy. That's well worth a read because it really highlights a lot of the issues. They talked to 335 people from 52 different countries, but at one point they say in this report, fee waivers can only ever be a short-term solution for LMICs, acting as a temporary fix to enable LMIC researchers to access northern-driven publishing systems. So if waivers are a temporary solution, I think the other action item for the community, right, is to figure out what is going to come after this temporary solution. And I will just stop there. I think that there is just a lot to talk about on this topic. I feel like this conversation really got a jump start at the B15 meeting. I think there's a lot of really smart people who care about this issue. And I'm pretty excited to see what kind of progress can be made around improving these waiver programs in the short term. And I think we better turn to questions here so we have a little bit of time. And Sara, were you gonna moderate the Q&A?
Can someone, maybe you, Curtis, can you tweet or share in Pathable the link to that report you just shared? Folks are asking.
Yeah, I'm tracking it down right now.
And then let me jump into Pathable. I can always count on Lisa with the first question. First question, how are university administrations in the global north feeling about higher prices to subvent a different, essentially diamond open access system? And just to define terms, diamond, Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong, journals that don't require APCs is the most basic definition. There's definitely some nuance I'm missing there. Curtis, do you want to dive into that first?
Oh, geez, Sara, I was trying to find that report.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Can you repeat the question?
I can go first. No, I can go first and you can circle back. So the question again was, how do university admins feel about basically cost shifting such that parts of the globe are paying less because they're paying more. And this is, in our experience, this is very regionally specific. In North America, this is a real priority. It's kind of a perfect storm of COVID, the social justice movement, the commitment of libraries to transform by community action. There's a very real mission driven imperative there. And I've been stunned by the number of institutions who, are not flourishing in their budgets, who are finding ways to support models, certainly like PLOS has, because this is a priority. Once you start moving into different regions, whether that's Latin America or Europe, the priorities change, particularly in places where APCs are a very entrenched business model where there's been a lot of investment. There's a lot less interest from library leadership. And it seems like in university leadership to really address that kind of cost redistribution type model. And in the US, I want to say that the administrative position is really being reflected by libraries, folks like Curtis taking a leadership position and putting a stake in the ground. So it's a mixed landscape, but definitely finding the US, Canada, and the UK are pretty invested in that kind of option. Sorry, Curtis, do you want to jump in now?
I think you covered it really well. I don't have a lot to add besides that, this is something that aligns well. I think most of our institutions, most of our organizations have, renewed our commitment around equity. And so the concept of having to pay more because we can, so in other parts of the world or under resourced institutions they can pay less. I don't think that's a controversial idea.
One of the things that I'm increasingly trying to do with our global North partners is share how much we've waived in fees to folks at their own institutions or at similar institutions, because it's moving everyone away for waivers isn't just about shifting cost based on geographic inequity. The more we can shift, certainly from PLOS's perspective, from individuals figuring out funds to collaborating with organizations to facilitate the cost of publishing, the less that, what was the point of this sentence? Oh, I can't remember where I was going with that. I'll come back to it. Other questions? I'm clearly not fully caffeinated. Let me check on Pathable. And Lisa's just following up by saying interest in the higher economic Asian countries. So far, from my experience, there's not a ton of interest in this particular topic. And I think that makes a lot of sense. We have to be really sensitive to the focus on DEI is not a global thing. It is certainly intense in certain regions, and it's a complete, it's a very foreign idea in other regions. And I think we have to bring that sensitivity to those conversations when we're engaging with partners globally. Colleen, when you think about it, US institutions are actually already sustaining the lion's share of costs in scholarly publishing when you consider how much libraries pay in subscriptions. That is probably true, certainly in the context of open access APC publishers that have only ever had that business model, particularly ones where the APCs are covering costs, but they're not doing a ton more than that. There's still a lot of shifting around that needs to be done, but I think that's a great point, Colleen. And that's all really going to change if we get into a place, A, where APCs become entrenched as the only model, and B, where waivers become the way of dealing with them. That there's going to be a lot of money that exits the system if we do it that way. That's going to create more barriers than less. Other questions or comments? With 1 minute left. Awesome. Well, thanks.
Hey,
yep.
Sarah, can I just say that, yeah, just in closing, I think folks who are interested in this, I think Sarah and I and Audrey would all be very interested in follow-up conversations on this topic. I feel like this is one where there is a lot of work to be done, and there's a little bit of convening involved, and there are action items here, and I think we would be thrilled to follow up with anybody on additional conversations on this topic.
Absolutely. And Audrey, is there anything else you're doing in this space right now? Not to put you on the spot, but the research, we are tweeting widely. So hopefully you'll get a lot of engagement with that. Yeah.
I don't know, there was other approaches that we wanted to take, like looking across disciplines and different journals, because there's certain disciplines that were represented in the year's mirror system. Honestly, I'm supposed to be focusing on my dissertation research.
Just-
Just like a side project.
So just
but-
to echo Audrey's comments for the folks online, there is further research they wanted to do around disciplines, but as with any side project, the main PhD work always
But I want to
takes
stay
the
engaged
lead.
because it's really important to me, actually, not just as an author, even though I'm from a Western country, that theoretically has access to resources. I don't personally have that many.
But that's very much a thing.
Right.
Yeah, plenty of individual authors. If we focus just on geographic inequity, we leave a whole bunch of authors behind who are geographically well located, but that doesn't suddenly mean they somehow have funding for this kind of business
I
model.
also work with a lot of researchers in Africa, so I'm really familiar with their lack of access to
Issues. Yep. Well, I think we're at time. I'm going to check Pathable one more time. Awesome. I think that's it. Anything else? Any other questions? I want to echo Curtis's call to action that we are eager to convene a group here to do more thinking about this and bring more transparency to this work. And we hope to hear from everyone. Have a great rest of the conference and a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.